Good evening, everybody. I'm Randy Gregg, Executive Director of the Portland Parks Foundation, and welcome to another webinar in our ongoing series. My notes here. An ongoing series devoted to Back to Square One, Reimagining O'Brien Square. Tonight we have Just Space, Beyond Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Design. I want to first thank our sponsor for tonight for the lecture series, U.S. Bank. This is the sixth and last of our series comparing notes between different cities and very different constituencies about the issues of O'Brien Square and of public space in general. I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall program for O'Brien. Let me switch screens here. One minute. There we go. So back to square one, rethinking O'Brien Square and how urban public space can work. We have a great group of sponsors for this effort. The Loeb Fellowship and North Star Civic Foundation, Metro, ZGF, Travel Portland, Multnomah County, the Schlesinger Family Foundation, Project, Canterbury Eddy Architects, ZGF, and GBD. And then also some really great in-kind support from MVP Capital and Metropolitan Group. So I want to talk a little bit about the ingredients to this effort, because it's going to be kicking off next week, where it's really an effort to create a community vision for O'Brien Square, or to begin to create a community vision. So first, who are we? Just for those of you who haven't been to some of the other talks, we're the Portland Parks Foundation. We do all kinds of different projects, ranging from big capital projects like the Barbara Walker Crossing, to Director Park, to a festival that we've done for a couple of years now called Paseo on the South Park blocks. That's a BIPOC-led festival for downtown. And then we're working on things like bringing back the Thompson Elk Fountain. Other folks involved with this are the Loeb Fellowship. This is a mid-career program at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And we've had 5 speakers and 5 participants who are coming from the alumni to help us out with this community vision effort. Great group of people. It's a really an honor to be among these folks. It's, as I said, mid-career program at Harvard to kind of let professionals kind of re-educate and re-inspire themselves, kind of restart. And then lastly, the Center for Public Interest Design at PSU, which is kind of like an architecture firm inside of PSU, guided by faculty, but the students are paid. And they do all kinds of interesting work in public spaces, like the Arleta Triangle Square, which was just opened some months ago, and the Opera a la carte. And they're also known for their really great tiny house villages that they've done for houseless vets and women. So our effort will kick off in earnest next week. There's a lot of ways to participate. So you can take a survey, and we've had over 150 responses so far to our survey, which is kind of incredible. Sabrina will put the link in the chat for that, and you can jump on there if you haven't had an opportunity to do that. Then Wednesday, we're going to have a big open house. We're taking over the old Finnegan's Toy Store right across the street from O'Brien Square, and it'll be open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And the Center for Public Interest Design will have a bunch of interactive exhibits, and there'll be people there who can interview you. There's lots of ways to participate. You can spend a couple of minutes, or you can spend an hour there. And it'll be both fun and we're really interested in your ideas. And then we'll go into kind of design phase for a couple of days with Center for Public Interest Design, the Loebs, and a bunch of other architects from about 15 firms. This is sort of a little visual diagram. This is my PowerPoint folk art, as I call it, kind of showing how this is going to work. So we're going to have some focus groups. We'll have the public input from the survey and the open house. And then we'll spend a day sifting and synergizing this work, and then spend a day with about 15 designers from contributing their work from local firms to visualize that. And then on Saturday, starting at 10 a.m., we'll have a feedback session so the public can come back and tell us how we did. And that'll be sort of the first phase of this effort. It'll ultimately result in a report and a proposal that we'll show to the city and other funders and hopefully get this thing on the road. There's other ways, of course, to participate. You can volunteer. We need a few volunteers to help us run the open house. So Sabrina can put the address for the intake form for that in the chat. And then, as always, you can contribute to us. We have a great group of sponsors, but this still takes a lot of work from our operating budget to make this happen. So if you feel inclined, please consider contributing. So back to our program tonight. In our 5 previous programs, we heard about sort of the larger issues around O'Brien, but we also heard from business people and real estate interests and social service organizations and street youth, aid organizations, and the Mayor's Point guy on downtown. We've enjoyed dispatches from our Loeb colleagues from Minneapolis, New York, DC, the Bay Area, and from LA. And you can catch all of these talks on our YouTube channel if you missed some of them. And all of this has been merely the first part of creating this community vision. So we hope you'll take part in the subsequent parts. Really want you involved. So Just Space, Beyond Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Design. What we're really getting at, what we wanted to get at in this program is kind of interactivity and participation in the creation of public space. And so we're honored tonight to have 3 designers who specialize in versions of it, some in politically challenging environments and some at a very large scale. It's a great group of folks. And to start us off is Damon Rich from Newark, New Jersey. He's a partner at Hector, an urban planning civic arts group. And he's both a Loeb and a MacArthur Fellow. And he develops vivid and witty strategies to help residents exercise power within the public and private processes that shape our cities. He works at a lot of different scales, from exhibitions to parks to the palette of an entire city. For instance, serving as chief urban designer and director of planning for Newark for 7 years. He engaged in a citywide coalition of neighborhood-based organizations and really uniquely participatory rewrite of the of the outdated zoning and land use regulations, basically their comprehensive plan. And really with the goals of environmental justice and accountable development. I wasn't there, but I've seen videos and images of it, and it looked like a hell of a lot of fun, certainly more fun than any comp plan rewrite I've ever been involved in. So with that, I really want to welcome Damon Rich.
Thanks so much, Randy. It is exciting to be here to share some experiences from a very different place with, I think, some very different people, in the hope that something of it might be useful or inspiring for this work going on at O'Brien. So let's see, can everyone see the screen all right?
You're good.
Super. I really wanted to share a design kind of born within conflict, based upon what I've been learning from Randy and others about O'Brien Square. And, I should say that none of the things I'm going to talk about tonight are put forth as original or new. They, in fact, are some, I think, very long-term wisdom gained from community organizers, from popular educators. And as an architect, I'll especially shout out what is now a 60-year-old tradition in this country that goes by the name of community design. And so conflict situations are something that one popular educator named Miles Horton talks about as times when we really see how the systems around us work. We really see their nuts and bolts because there's major breakdowns or there's major questions about how we should organize our life together. And land use issues and architecture and planning have no shortage of conflicts when it comes to how we use, plan, and finance our spaces. And one thing that these other disciplines, I think, have really taught me as an architectural and urban designer is to very much not think about good design as driven at its core by ideas. Some kind of mystical, fantastic idea that is so good that it makes its way around the pitfalls and the potholes and the obstacles of politics to be realized for the public. And instead, it's taught me much more to try to act like I'm showing up at a party where I really don't know anyone. And I'm just really grateful for anyone that'll catch my eye and talk to me for a little bit. And slowly, if I'm lucky, I'll build up a little group of people that I get to talk to. And who knows, we might just, go grab some food afterwards. So the story I want to tell you tonight, these are some of the people and organizations that made it happen, who played those roles that I just showed. And what I'd like to do is to first share a little bit of an overview of the design of this place, some of which has already been constructed and some of which is very much in progress. And then I'd like to share 8 tips about what made it possible to really deal with creating a design within a very complex web of relationships that sometimes were joyous and sometimes were conflicted. So when you come to the entrance of this park, you'll see a pretty traditional layout, some different colored paving stones, some places to sit, a boulder. You might notice some of the local architecture, like this Buddhist temple across the street. The colors, maybe you'll appreciate for a moment off of the boulders, reflecting some of that local architecture. Maybe you'll notice these engraved stones in the ground that it contains some strange diagrams that talk about why this space exists, how the water that comes from the rain caused the city to have to dig out this whole area to manage its runoff so it can get treated and not flood the sewer system. If you look a little bit, a couple inches over, you might see this engraved stone that talks about all of the organizations within the government, outside the government, that it took to come together to make this space, including a mark of the linguistic history and present of the area. And as you enter this park, you might start to see some of the other parts of this larger plan, which took as its watchword, make room for everyone. So coming from this entry, you'll start to see more places to sit than there were before, if you ever visited. You might see some places for sports and athletic activity that are more concentrated in the plan, that unlike some parks that put a fence around every single sport, this allows these more flexible sports yards for all the types of things that people like to do, like this foot volleyball that's called Tukra, with some hills to look at it. You'll see a lot of people gambling and playing volleyball and bragging about their records. The playground is kind of interesting. It's like very much spread out from what it used to be, with all kinds of strange objects that have now been kind of recruited into various imaginary practices by kids and their guardians. But also, very importantly, the different age groups have these clearly delineated areas, which is part of some anti-bullying organizing that young people were doing at the time. And then there's a whole half of the park now that is really meant to be a quieter landscape with some meditative places, some mandalas that you can walk, some strange sculptures kind of poking their head out of the landscape, which are nice to look at, but also stop people from playing soccer and other sports in the quiet area. You'll see lots of boulders to look at, little pieces of nature, rain gardens you can walk through. And of course, y'all in Portland are like rain garden heroes of the universe. And the other part of the design that people talked about was you need to make this South Philly, but with some perks. So rooting it in the identity and specificity of this place. And so you might start to learn some of the stories, not just about the rainwater infrastructure, but you might see some sculptures carved in the shapes of famous mountains in Burma. You might see some hills that are kind of unusual in this part of Philly. You might see some culturally specific seating furniture that people who grew up in Korea or China or Cambodia or Laos might find familiar. And there's other types of strange markers and things that people have built over over the years, especially here in the middle of the park, where there's a new bathroom and a meeting room that kind of takes on the architecture of all the strange buildings that you might find in a place like South Philly. And so this, like I said, is a quick overview of a design that is certainly underway that tries to build on some of the things people love about this place, like those food vendors, but also really extend it to really reflect the desires and the proud culture that made the place possible. So with that, I'd like to, say, all right, design is great. I'm a designer. Of course, I like design. But what were some of the structural conditions that made this design possible and filled it out? So tip number one is who sets the table. Like, so important who sets the table. So important who sends out those first invitations. How something like this builds from a smaller group to a larger group. In the case of Mifflin Square, this work began in earnest in the summer of 2016 when people were flooding to airports in protest of exclusionary policies that were being put into place. And 6 organizations, the Bhutanese American Organization, the Cambodian Association, the Friends of Mifflin Square, the Karen Community, United Communities, which came from an old settlement house, and convened by CMAC. These all were organizations that had deep roots in this area of Philadelphia and a lot of skin in the game. And so they decided to join forces even more deeply than before and start to advocate for this open space, which, as you can see here, is a very rare square of green in a very densely packed landscape. People live in row houses and shop on the shopping street. There's a really wide variation of household income you can see from north of 70 down to the 20s. Likewise, a real variation in homeowners versus tenants and the amount of people's income that they pay for rent. Self-identified race and ethnicity is really uniquely all mixed up in a very segregated city and a very segregated country, as well as the national origins that people claim. So in this park, this manifests as like a lot of activity and users like all the time, which is amazing, but it also, of course, results in a lot of overuse. And if there's under maintenance, that manifests in broken down playgrounds, not enough capital investment for benches. So you have elders sitting on curbs. People bring their own chairs so they can play card games. And the one bench is like not even facing the right way. Again, people build volleyball courts like this one in the background, but it's difficult because all these things that people call the pizza pie wedges of grass are broken up by curbs. So they might build their own foot volleyball to crawl court, but when it rains, it's a mud hole. There's not great places to perform, so people perform in the path and then kind of stand in the grass and watch. There's a lot of bullying, like I said, among the kids. So every older kid kicks out another younger kid, and then some of the kids don't have challenging enough places to play, so they knock down porta-johns and things. There's not places for adult exercise. And what really catalyzed this group to come together was some gunplay in the park, which only happens every couple of years, but that resulted in a real overreaction by the authorities, including wiping out a beloved set of maybe not always licensed, but delicious food vendors. And so CMAC convened this group to try to do something about it. Tip number 2 is to make policy public. The first thing that happened was a summer youth employment program where a group of young people were charged by their elders to answer the question, what does Southeast Philly have to do to get Mifflin Square Park rebuilt how it wants? So it was about brainstorming about parks, but then inventorying and documenting the specific park to make existing conditions drawings, going to the library to understand its history and how it changed and how the politics changed over time. And really importantly, interviewing all kinds of VIPs, neighborhood leaders, capital projects directors at the city's parks departments. And every time the students would do these drawings, that would give their sociological analysis of what these people were saying and whether it made sense or not, and all the hypocrisies that we as adults are putting out all the time. And they found out that a lot of the stories they were given, like, oh, well, violence or like litter weren't such big problems until these most recent immigrants came. They found those things to be lies by, finding newspaper stories about campaigns for clean streets in the 1920s, about all kinds of youths knifing and gunning each other up in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s. And when they met the city council person, he said, I know you think $5 million is an impossible amount of money to raise, but believe me, the money is not the problem. Getting all these eccentric South Philly residents to agree on a design, that's the problem. So the students were able to bring back everything they learned to make these exploratory drawings that were meant to start conversations. Who runs Philly parks? How are parks treated differently? What kind of people are in Mifflin Square? Meek Mill was a really big Philly MC, so this is named Park Dreams and Nightmares, where it shows, well, what would be the dream version of Mifflin Square and what would be the nightmare? One student investigated all the different community organizations to figure out what they might bring to and how they might benefit from a coalition, represented by this giant figure that like ingests all the organizations into like a giant agent. And these kinds of drawings were then displayed for the council member, the other leaders that we met in the park. Students gave tours of them, and that became one of the biggest introductions and invitations to tip number 3, which was community conversations. And these were really where people had to look at the space and try to connect with each other. And it began with a newspaper made from those high school students' work that could be circulated, that then invited organized groups like parent-teacher organizations, churches, mosques, temples, to host these meetings in their spaces with their people to just talk about dimensionally what might be possible in this space, but also emotionally what might be important, based on our memories, what might be important. And so all these individual groups were able to come up with these different kind of displays. And at times, some of the most touching moments where people's identities started out as seeming so different, but began to kind of find points of connection and fusion, like this gentleman on the left who says, oh, well, my parents moved to Philly from the farm in Alabama, so getting here was like this traumatic and wild experience. And this woman who had just come from Burma 2 years before was like, holy moly, that's exactly what happened to me. So tip number 4 was coming from discussions like that. How can you keep on enlarging the circle of people who have a stake in this, who aren't just being engaged as residents or citizens, but who actually are being invited in to be part of a coalition that if it doesn't grow large enough, nothing will happen. So resident design fellows were a group of stipended people that could fill out a very simple application that then could be chosen by the organizational staff, and they formed different types of committees to focus on vending or places to sit. And they were really instrumental in doing pilot projects, which is like, all right, people talk about seating, let's build some picnic tables and see what happens. Okay, that worked well, let's get more ambitious and design and build this super seating with a group called Public Workshop, Tiny WPA in Philly. And CMAC was able to get a licensed food truck to start vending again. So tip 6 is negotiating in public. So important that people with different visions and interests hear and have to deal with the visions and interests of others. So here we really figured out that over time, these city and DIY interventions had created all this unusable space. And so the idea became, how can we rearrange things to make this work better? And that required talking to the volleyball players, the moms, the guys who just hang out, the young kids. Taking it back to the city, talking about different variations that might get the job done, bringing all those different people together to interact with each other and offer their criticisms and support in the park. And then finally get into some real negotiations. And as we say, we never talk about what makes a just space. What we talk about is, where does the volleyball court go? So tip 7 is organizing gets the goods. That entry that I showed you was only possible because one day the water department showed up and said, we're going to dig up your park, but we're going to put it back just the same way that we found it. But because these communities were organized with design resources and things like that, they were able to say, we don't want it back the way it was. The way it was not very easy to sit and gather. So we already have relationships with kids. Let's talk about the different wild ideas they have for it to be striped, multicolored. How can we find a way to stretch $10,000 to build this space? And so that resulted in what I showed you. And then the final tip is just keep on going. keep on drawing the vision, iterating it, finding ways to draw other people into it by changing something in the actual design, publicizing it, spreading the word, having petitions. And so when I get to visit very, very soon and see O'Brien's Park, O'Brien Square in the flesh, I'm so excited to actually meet so many of the people who have been on these YouTubes, who are going to create those coalitions that try to bring this place back to life, back to connected to what makes Portland go. So I look forward to seeing y'all.
Thanks so much, Damon. Super inspiring. How big is that park?
About 4 acres.
About 4 acres. Okay. Yeah, we have a much smaller palette, but we can get into that later. Let's see here. So next up is Kareem Hassanein. He's the director of storytelling for Colocate Design, a firm that focuses on expanding community access to and building power through the design of social, civic, and cultural spaces. Before coming to Colocate, Kareem worked as storytelling and communication strategist for Bora Architects for quite a long time, about 8 years. And so he was right across the street from O'Brien Square. He's also served as the board president of Open Signal, a really great media organization in the city. But the seeds of his interests sprouted as a landscape architect student at UO. And you can see it in his award-winning thesis, Powerful Places, Suppression and Expression in Cairo's Urban Spaces. That was a case study in transferring political agency and spatial power that emerged in the civil unrest in Cairo to the creation of a democratic park. So with that, Kareem, take it away.
Thank you, Randy. And it's cool to follow Damon. We hadn't seen everyone's slides, but I feel like a lot of what we're going to be talking about overlaps really well. So it's exciting to be in the space and be learning from each other and with each other too. I'm going to try to share my screen, make sure that that works. And any thumbs up that that's coming through for folks?
You're good.
Awesome. So, hello, my name is Kareem Hassanein, and you gave a lovely introduction of who I am as a person. I want to give a little bit of an intro to what Colocate does as a practice. So we are a multidisciplinary nonprofit design justice practice. And design justice, I'm going to define that in a moment, the way that we talk about it and approach it, but it's really a movement, right? It's not just a consulting niche that we're hoping more consultants will fit into this niche. To reference some of what Damien was talking about, organizing really is at the core of our ethos as movement practitioners, designers in community and of community. So we are organizing, advocating, and designing spaces of racial, social, and cultural justice throughout the built environment, and not limiting ourselves to the spatial implications of the work that we do, but really thinking about power, policy, procedure, pedagogy. They don't all start with P, but a lot of them do. So what is design justice for us? For nearly every injustice, there is an architecture, there's a plan, there's a design that sustains it. And looking at those injustices, we believe that the role of designers as practitioners, as professionals, and as workers is to forward radical liberatory visions of racial, social, and cultural reparation. It's not, again, enough for us to look and say, how do we improve this space? How do we make it feel better or look better? What are the injustices that are made manifest through the built environment, through the physical landscape around us? And how do we repair those harms before we consider what we're building on top of them or for the future? So with that, we want to constantly be orienting ourselves towards design justice and asking ourselves really critical questions at every step of the way. And these are the core questions that we ask, not just once, but throughout our work on projects, in our dialogue with clients, in our dialogue with community members that are impacted by our work. First and foremost, what are the issues that are impacting the communities that we are working with and working within? The folks who are most directly impacted by our work are the people that we forefront as our core stakeholders. And the issues that impact them are the things that we need to be considering. And then we have to think about what the power structures are that are at the root of those issues within community. Power structures are constantly reinforcing themselves, whether we recognize them or not. And so we don't view design as a neutral process. I love that diagram with all the arrows that Damon showed of landscape architecture, architecture planning, and politics infusing all of it, because our work is political, whether we recognize it or choose not to. Who is directly and disproportionately impacted by these issues? How does the built environment perpetuate these issues? And can we imagine new opportunities to address those issues and build by design? So fundamentally, those questions revolve around power, around the values that we hold as a society and reinforce through our built environments. I was just in leading a training for 4 hours right before this meeting. So you might notice I'm a little slow, but also we were talking about this with Multnomah County, the folks who were inviting us into that training, and really addressing the ways that the ownership of space and governance of space is ownership and governance of resources and how those are allocated, which is a direct exertion of power. And we can't be complacent around that. We as designers play a role within that ecosystem and within that dynamic of reinforcing power or challenging it. So that also requires us to care deeply about the conditions and experiences of those who are marginalized in our society, and should get us thinking critically about culture and how culture is central to understanding the experiences, the ways that systems of power impact communities of culture and operate in communities of culture as well. So we're thinking about the power structures and dynamics that impact a community, and also within a community, who are the leaders? Why are they the leaders? How do we communicate in a respectful and culturally competent way? Not just competent, but with humility around communities of culture that we might not be a part of ourselves. So all of those things lead us to thinking about process, policy, and power. And these are things that, again, I feel like I'm in good company in this conversation, but sadly, in my experience in the design industry, architects and spatial designers more broadly are not taught to consider or are taught to accept as status quo and the conditions within which we work. But process and policy are design parameters. They are constraints, and they are also opportunities. And we need to be thinking about how our dominant practice models impact the safety and well-being of our most marginalized stakeholders. So why should we care about process or policy if our role is design? Well, you've probably seen these kinds of iceberg diagrams before. What we're able to see on the surface is held up and created by significant sets of unseen structures, sometimes more visible than others. But the design of a space is just the tip of that iceberg. So what's possible at that tip and the processes through which we approach design are often determined by deep and sometimes unconsidered policies and procedures. These are the systems of power, right, that can determine how successful design is able to be at meeting the needs of those users who are most impacted and disproportionately left out of the decision-making process. So focusing, again, only on the tip doesn't create change within the system towards liberated outcomes in the future. And we need to be thinking about policy and procedure if we really care about those outcomes. I will come back to this image, but first I want to spend a moment on what we mean by liberation. I know there's lots of definitions that folks may have in their minds, and sometimes liberty and liberation and freedom get conflated. When we talk about design justice, we're oriented towards liberation, which requires a radical reframing of our position as people within an industry, namely the design industry, and a recognition of where we are now. So I think over the last few years, maybe more people have become familiar with the sort of differentiation between ideas of equality and equity, both of which are important and necessary conditions for a just society. But moving into justice requires us to repair injustice, as I referenced previously, and make changes to existing systems to remove barriers towards continued progress. We can't do that alone as designers. We have to do that with that organizing mindset. We also need to understand that oppression is traumatic and ongoing across multiple generations. And liberation is a constant societal orientation towards the holistic well-being of all. It is a commitment from each person to contribute according to their strengths and abilities, and an assurance that each person will receive what they need in order to thrive, which requires us to put our power and resources to work to heal traumas of oppression with every tool and discipline at our disposal, which sadly can feel far from where we find ourselves most of the time. But again, there are examples out there in the world, including the ones that Damon just shared. And it's an important reminder that I like to bring too, that liberation isn't just a future outcome. It's always present in movements and in moments around us. The seeds exist in the ways that we relate to one another because power is relational. And in that relationship dynamic, there are signals and there are receivers. This is where all those keywords that I was throwing out there earlier come into play. The design profession, like all institutions, imposes its power through policies, through procedures, practices, and is subject to its own inherited biases, the ways that we are taught to practice, the ways that we are taught to ask questions or not, the ways that we are taught to value the client without necessarily being critical about who the client is or who the client wants us to be considering. And the institution of architecture has the power to speak the language of the people it serves, but we as designers are at our best when we are willing to serve those who have the least amount of influence or power in a given dynamic or project, especially because of the lasting permanence of our professions and the decisions that we make. We have to pay that particular attention to the injustices that result from our work. And it can feel disempowering at times, being in an architectural design role or environmental design role, to be told no, to be told these are the limits, to be told the time and the money just aren't there. We can't think outside the box. But although we might not have that power ourselves, we are conduits of those resources and that power. We have visibility and we have the language and the tools to understand the systems more than many of the folks that we interact with on the stakeholder side of things or the community side of things. So how are we using our position as conduits of influence in the opposite direction? And how are we making the process more understandable and transparent to the folks who we are impacting? Put another way, we exist in oppressive systems, whether we create those systems or not. It's the framework that we work within. And so we have an obligation to each other. If I operate in a system that wants me to perpetuate racist policies or minimize or dismiss the experiences of people who have less money or who are unhoused or who don't speak the language that is dominant in the society that I'm operating within in a systematically traumatizing way, it's incumbent upon me as a designer to shed that and align myself with a liberatory position. So there are examples of these signals that we are receiving constantly, and there are ways for us to receive and respond to them that are radically different than the intended signal. At the surface, for example, on projects that we might work on, we follow building and zoning codes and design standards that determine levels of public well-being and safety. But are we asking the question of whose well-being and safety are we containing within that moniker, that identity of the public? Is anyone left out of that? Zoning codes, which we follow as professionals as well, have historically marginalized Black and brown communities through redlining, preventing people from being able to own homes, decimating the opportunity for communities of color and culture to build generational wealth. And architects have had a choice on whether or not to respond to that signal And as Whitney Young said, actually in Portland, 50 odd years ago, the profession has been thunderously silent because of our orientation as a service industry to clients where we don't necessarily see ourselves as responsible for the broader systemic outcomes. It's also constrained by the ways that we practice spatial design. So governance structures decide how decisions are made within our own project teams, within our clients' organizational structures. Is decision-making coming from a steering group of socially privileged individuals deciding what resources will be available to marginalized communities that they cannot relate to, perhaps, and often in my experience? If we're not directly connecting with the design process from that vantage point, then we are again perpetuating the process that reinforces the inherent and existing status quo power dynamics. So even when those at the top of an institutional power hierarchy are deeply concerned with well-being and safety of those who are impacted by a project, our processes aren't generally designed to facilitate healing. They move so quickly that there's rarely time to build trust in communities who already have every justification for distrusting the process. And then there's also how projects are funded, where dollars need to be spent and who decides that. And again, when do those dollars need to be spent, whether it's a public bond project where the timeline has been predetermined before any community engagement has taken place at all. Those divorces in impacts versus intentions prevent us from engaging in the kind of iterative design process with priority communities that, again, Damon was referencing in his presentation. So all of that means in terms of our practice and praxis, first and foremost, that we are shifting how we engage and moving away from this idea of outreach to an idea of organizing, building power with communities and for communities. And we like to use this little diagram to kind of show how we're trying to tilt that scale. So outreach is primarily and predominantly an extractive process. Although these terms often get conflated, outreach and engagement, I don't believe are the same thing. We're extracting information, maybe we're sharing some information, but it's through our filter on what people need to know. And we only take the information back that we think our client wants or that we think is relevant. We are constantly editorializing throughout this process. Engagement can be more of a dialogue, but again, how are we putting resources into that engagement and making sure that we're showing up where people already are, rather than just asking them to show up at a public meeting that we broadcast on the internet that people without a decent internet connection or a computer at home might not know about. Organizing is about mobilizing. It's about putting the time and money into the community so that they can mobilize themselves, so that the culture bearers, the storytellers, the existing leaders in the community, the people who know where every crack on the sidewalk is and who tripped over it for the last 20 years or 30 years or multiple generations, are leading the conversation. And those are things that I think can and should be explored in this redesign for O'Brien. So I know we'll talk about that, but I'll kind of end on this example of how we approach organizing within the context of our design projects. So something that we try to bring on every one of our projects is a community design advocate or community design organizer cohort. These folks are integral to our design team. They are recruited from the communities and stakeholder groups that are most impacted by the project, again, and they are compensated. They bring their relationships with their own communities that I could never hope to replicate in the span of a single project or build that kind of trust from, a timeline of 3 months of design. And we work with CDAs, community design advocates, to provide transparency into the process, support them in organizing their own engagement activities, which can be as simple as just a bunch of one-on-one conversations throughout the duration of the design phases, or as complex as organizing focus groups or workshops, or letter writing campaigns to request more time for a particular project that is moving on at a pace that doesn't allow for trust building and true influence. Again, they're paid for their work. They are on board as early as possible. they have the ability to influence our projects because we shifted the locus of accountability from me as community engagement and design consultant to this group of impacted community members that are actively meeting with us on a weekly basis and telling us exactly what they think and what the issues are and how this project affects them, whether the client wants to hear that or not. If the client doesn't want to hear it, they have to say, why not? Because now there are a group of folks who are directly impacted, who are in the room at the table, able to influence decisions. And that can look like a lot of things. It can look like community education. We're co-teaching some classes at Jefferson High School right now to be able to build relationships with students, to build their understanding of design processes so that they can give meaningful feedback and it's not tokenizing or just purely checking a box and extracting information. Community storytelling and intergenerational placekeeping. So more often than not, when we ask people what they need in order to feel, for example, a sense of safety and belonging, it's access to things like mental health care or housing security or food security and spaces of cultural celebration and joy. It's about being able to gather and be in relationship with a multi-generational community in the face of displacement and ongoing impacts of gentrification. For youth, it's about finding those connections to mentors and community leaders they can see themselves in. So we have to be critiquing and thinking about the entire system, and these types of forums organized by and for community members help us to get at that. And we're also hosting dialogue that centers those issues in a way that doesn't necessarily have a explicit design impact, right? It's not like we can turn around and say, this conversation that community members wanted to have and hosted themselves around trauma and healing in community is going to look like this when we design the building. But we as designers can interpret that conversation in a way and bring forth proposals. The conversation has to happen for healing to be even an option on the table and for people to believe that it's possible. Our role can sometimes just be to create a forum, provide the resources, and listen. And sometimes that's the best way that we can show up. So I'll end on this slide just to say our industry has access to tremendous power and capital. And again, although we don't always own it, we are those conduits, we are those translators of power and capital into the built environment. We turn those resources and that power into physical environments through our labor. And we might not be able to create liberatory systems in the span of a single project, but we can use every project to organize with systematically marginalized communities and advocate for policies and procedures that reinforce safety and a sense of belonging by the definitions that impacted stakeholders bring to us and not those that we or our systems want to impose upon them. And I always ask folks to think about the role that we play in that feedback loop, that system and receiver cycle, that signal and receiver cycle. We hold multiple identities ourselves. We might be impacted by these systems as we perpetuate them. And thinking about that position, thinking about the impacts that we may or may not experience ourselves should build empathy, curiosity, and critical lens through which we continue to do our work, and maybe change the ways that we work ourselves. If our organizations prevent us from doing that, our practices need to change. Maybe the ways that our clients are structured need to change, and we are in a position to offer that critique, whether it's directly invited or not. Okay, I will stop there. I think I ran a little bit long, so forgive me, but I'll pass it back to you, Randy.
You bet. Thanks, Kareem. Lots to discuss. So our last speaker, Kelsey Snook, works in a kind of different dimension. She creates interactive environments in North America and Europe to allow people to lean in, connect, and participate. Locally, she's developed projects for OMSI and Portland Art Museum and Design Week. And among her international projects are the 75th anniversary celebration for the Walker Arts Center and the opening ceremony for the Queen of England at London's Royal Festival Hall, and a music mural for the MUTEC Extramuros musical festival in Montreal. But what captured our attention is a project called the Museum of Possibilities. And she works in a lot of interactive ways that bring some of the thinking that we've heard about kind of to the experience of open spaces. So with that, please take it away, Kelsey.
Thank you. I am going to share my screen. And play. And can I just get a thumbs up if that's
Yep, you're good.
visible? Okay, giant green thing. Okay, so yes, I am asking everyone to kind of shift their brains slightly over from what we have been thinking about for a moment. I agree wholeheartedly with Damon and Kareem's approach, or approaches and processes that have been outlined. And I'm not advocating for something that shortchanges any of that depth. What I'd like, the shift I'm getting us to make together is just thinking about how, as we're on this journey of rethinking O'Brien Square, and we share the intentions of process and approach that we've just heard about, what are the ways that we can actually on the ground start doing through temporary installations? Like, how can a temporary installation help be an active partner to host those productive conversations, so that you can have all those conversations happening and there's evidence of it in front of us as a place to go to? That's the shift I want to make, because if you look at my slides, you think like, wait, why is this person doing like really cool positive things and not talking about those other discussions? So without further ado, my name is Kelsey. I work frequently with this design studio in Montreal called Daily Tous les Jours, and I say that because many of my projects are with them. And so what I do is basically designing shared experiences. But I think about how people interact and are empowered within those experiences to have a place in the story, those stories told around them. And just very briefly, the types of projects, Randy already mentioned this: Design Week, Portland, headquarters in Pioneer Courthouse Square, where this is a giant walkthrough calendar of events and a live hand illustrated Twitter feed, so that any stranger to Design Week could just instantly know what it was about and be brought into that festival in an inclusive way. Also, a conversation wall for Umpqua Bank in Seattle, Washington, where it helped this bank branch become a good neighbor immediately when it moved in, by inviting people to fill in the blank to this sentence and then be a host of events that it's scheduled there. We created a giant sing-along for the Minnesota State Fair. There's so many different installations and booths at the State Fair, but this was the first installation that was a collectively generated playlist that anyone could vote in to become the songs and then walk up to or roll or up to and sing along together. And this is an installation for called Memorama for the Village Street Festival in Montreal, that made digital postcards that you could instantly send directly from the street with selfies that nobody could have taken on their own. And a hotline for the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that was where anyone walking up could ask a question about what they saw in this public institution directly to the public institution and get answers from the artists that were curated and from the curators and anyone else who like all sorts of different staff from behind the scenes. And recently, I've been working with the Bentway in the city of Toronto on a paper publication for what play can do at the city, challenging the idea of what play is, who it's for, and what it can do, especially relating to collective mental health. Right now, what I'm working on is an installation for Mill Ridge Park outside of Nashville, Tennessee. It's called Whistle to Ready. And it is a musical path based on how marching bands work. So it gets people walking by on this path to sync up like a marching band would, but it mixes 3 different music genres together that are based on the music of residents in the local community, and that's Kurdish, Mexican, and marching bands from the high school that lives across the street, or is across the street. So the connection to rethinking O'Brien Square, if we go back to this idea of shared experiences and thinking about how people interact and are empowered to have a place in the stories told around them, this happens in the process, not just in the final product. It's not just this great installation, a subjectively great installation that has people interacting and doing fun things that you can see. That happens throughout the process so that it can be the best final product possible. And all of that process, we've just heard what a good process can be like. So I'm not going to define that. But what I will say is, quote one of my mentors who says, when there's been participation in the process, you feel it in the bricks. And that is a weighty sentence. It's what we are obliged to live up to from now until whatever the future is, whatever this thing will be that is created. And so if I rewind to that project that we've been working on with Mill Ridge Park, this is the messy, like just a little tiny sprinkling of what the process has been to create this installation that's being installed now, where we had many community meetings. As Damon said, some of it was joyous and some of it was conflicted. But in the end, there were many talks with neighbors and many ideas about dreams and negotiations about what would be possible, and then knowledge sharing. And finally, the ability to translate what is happening with the local residents who are going to own this park ultimately as their own, can be co-authors in this installation that is made, so that they contributed the music and contributed to the design, so that everything about the way that you walk and the way that you move and what you hear comes from them and is infused in the installation. So when I just think about how temporary installations can host productive conversations, I think about some design criteria that I would do if I was just going to make something immediately appear when this is a construction site that acts as a helpful entity that can host productive conversations. And that means even if it is this one place, it's still, there's the ability to meet people where they are, even if they're not physically there, you know, to meet the different players and residents. And it makes it clear that all of those players and stakeholders and people involved, they're invited to the conversation. And when that we mean a conversation, we mean talking and listening. And that the installation can help do that as well. And that there is this, Damon and Kareem both talked about this idea of shared ownership. I mean, that's just a part of it from the get-go, that whatever we're doing, we're open to and building on ideas, and we're trying things out. And another one of my mentors that I take to heart said, start with small wins, not epic failures. And I mean that even in the installation itself, not just conversations. And so I want to talk about that one project that Randy mentioned, this Museum of Possibilities in Montreal. I was part of a group invited to create a ribbon cutting ceremony for a patch of grass in Montreal that was going to potentially be part of the city's initiative to launch a cultural quarter called the Quartier des Spectacles, the neighborhood of spectacles. And they wanted the mayor to come and ribbon cut a patch of grass. And so as a consultant, we started to question the idea of what are we even launching with a ribbon cutting ceremony here. And so we had a counter proposal that was, there was no ribbon to cut, but we would, on the open museum day where there was an entire neighborhood worth of events, we would create a pop-up museum. And we called this the Museum of Possibilities. And it was a temporary one-day museum that people could walk into. So it created a sense of space. And we invited people to come up with ideas of what they wanted to see, meet, or do in the space in the future. And so we came up with these different easy prompts to give juice of possibilities. And we had things like what, how, with whom, and when people might want to do things in the space in the future. And then what we did was invited people to come up with ideas, write them down on a card, and hang them up in our museum. So if you think about the logistics of YouTube, where I believe 1% of YouTube are content creators and the other 99% are just watchers, onlookers, or maybe voters. That was the principle we applied to our Museum of Possibilities, where we worked hard to get people to create contributions of what they would hope to do in this space in the future, to create a set of content for the client that would give them ideas of what should be happening in that space, how you could get repeat visitors to it in the future. By creating events and programming that would be relevant to the people who are both residents and visitors to this neighborhood. And so we worked hard to create that content of contributions in the museum, but we also gave every single visitor power by giving these little yes stickers. And so anybody who contributed an idea also was a voter, and anyone who visited this space was a voter. And so this meant that people weren't just contributing an idea and walking away as though like that was easy, I did it, or kind of hard to actually come up with an idea and I did it. It meant that everybody was cross-pollinating and reading each other's ideas so that there was some elevation of the kind of content that was given. And what that ended up doing was giving the client, the Quartier du Spectacle, an idea, a long list of ideas of what people were interested in the park, but also a ranking of interest in all of those ideas. So this could become a launching point for them to start their programming in the future. It was all the investment of funds to create a ribbon cutting ceremony would have just cut the ribbon and evaporated. But we gave them this temporary installation, which was extremely cost effective, public gathering of ideas and ranking of ideas to build programming on in the future. And what that ended up doing was creating the grounds for our next installation, which meant, which we called Block Jam, and which is just around the corner on the street from this patch of grass. So from this patch of grass, you're seeing a building that was a direct neighbor. And so what this is a music festival that was inside of a building, and we put it on the outside of the building. So we're starting to show signs of life of what this new cultural quarter is, even though it's on the side of a building that's actually a science, like a scientific laboratory facility that wants to be a neighbor within this new cultural quarter. And so what that looked like was this building facade that was a giant, we called it a radio station, but the way that you listened to and controlled the radio station yourself was to use what you have in your pocket, your speaker and your controls that you have in your pocket. So anybody with a phone actually from home or on their mobile phone on the street, coming outside of the metro station, could control the music. So this is a giant music visualizer that everybody was collaborating on this musical piece. And it was a way of taking a music festival that not everyone was invited to, no one could hear on the street, and making that music festival visible through this temporary installation. And so the brief for this type of installation came from this temporary installation that was in this patch of grass. And what ended up happening with this small win of the patch of grass is creating content for what we might want a collective vision for what we might want to do in the future, that could then allow support and budget for a slightly more complex installation. And then moving on from that and seeing the proof of concept for there, I know I'm changing the vantage points here in each of the photos, but this patch of street is directly below the science building that we were just looking at. And the patch of grass is in the background. And this is literally a strip of sidewalk between two three-way car lanes. So it's in between traffic, but we got budget to manifest an installation that was part of that partner of the sciences building and the music partners in this cultural quarter, so that now we have the science faculty from that museum. We're going down, doing workshops with them, talking about the ideas of what they were studying about this music of cooperation, or the idea of cooperation, and something stuck to when we were in those conversations, talking about we do more together than we can achieve more together than we do alone. So we took that as a manifesto for this installation, and ended up having different musicians contribute to the sounds that were in these swings, that you create that music when you swing back and forth, but the more you cooperate with your neighbors, the more is unlocked in the installation. And so this ended up becoming a temporary installation to kind of manifest the neighbors nearby. But then, due to that installation's success in creating a sense of space, it has become an annual installation since the year that it started, and has continued now. So if we go back to this patch of grass and its inaugural ribbon cutting ceremony budget, we were able to grow from that little seed into create a larger and larger proof of concept that involves more and more stakeholders into the conversation, all with some level of ownership in it, and proving that we can do more. And so I forgot to play that video while I was talking, but that's going to be the end of what I'm my contribution here, is just in thinking about how the kinds of conversations that we have, that we want to be having, that we can start from the beginning with the seeds of a very small effort in a space, and create iterations that can build on ideas that are part of these conversations, try things out, and gradually grow up and build up with small wins with all of those partners to continue to grow into what we want it to be. And with that, I will stop sharing and hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Kelsey. So everybody, our audience, please put your questions in the Q&A. Welcome to chat amongst yourselves in the chat, but let's put the questions in the Q&A. So first off, do you any of you have sort of responses to each other's work within this you'd like to share?
I'll just offer that, as somebody who studied architecture and had basically zero exposure to many decades of of people who, were trying to work with communities, doing temporary work, doing long-term work, finding ways that design tools could actually be helpful in a larger process of organizing and political struggle. It is, it's just been really heartening, I think, to see, I think, people becoming, more aware of that tradition and picking it up and reinventing it and remixing it and doing it in all kinds of ways, because we need all kinds of ways and all kinds of people doing it. So I'm grateful for it.
Other thoughts? I'd kind of like to, all of your work is kind of centered in, divining the community will in some way. And one of the perplexing things about O'Brien Square is, who is the community? There's sort of a commercial community, there's a social service community, there's not a lot of people living there. The history is primarily a commercial history. It's a city, it's downtown. And so when you kind of look at O'Brien, and who do you see as the community that we most need to bring to the table in order to create the kind of space that you all have been really engaged in?
I just humbly, I feel like I trust Damon and Kareem's approaches as an in-depth approach, but just having done workshops in town and for places where often a client is saying, can you make this patch of grass, a strip of sidewalk, a destination? Can you turn this into a destination for us? Part of the questions might be around, who do we want to be there in the future? Like, how can we, what have been other successful equitable spaces in and around the city, and how are those composed, and how can we replicate that sense of a draw? Like, how can we go and meet the audiences that we hope to have come here, and how can we have them be a part of the conversation even though they're not a direct neighbor? There are great needs in this city for a living room of the city, for example, for lack of a better word. And Pioneer Courthouse Square is an attempt at that, but there are other versions of it, and there are other versions of it needed. And so I think part of the question is, how could this be a living room of Portland? And who can we invite to the table? Who can help represent how that can happen?
Damon, did you want to chime in on that?
Oh, no.
I totally agree with that. I think it is a super complex question containing a lot of other questions, because, like, first and foremost, we have to define community, and no community in and of itself is monolithic, but from the approach that at least I take and CoLocate brings, community isn't geography. Like, that's not the sole defining factor. However, culture is critical to a community self-identity. And in this space, like, I would ask the question, do the commercial entities, companies, businesses, organizations that occupy the geography truly comprise a community, or are they a collection of vested stakeholders who have a particular set of interests in how space is used because it impacts how they are trying to leverage the resources that they have to support their businesses or organizations, do the work that they're trying to do, attract the clientele that they're trying to attract. And how does that juxtapose against the communities that actually do share culture and require or seek out the resources contained in this part of the city. And so, you know, I know there's a kind of a tension or a friction between, for example, what's the hotel? It's not the Four Seasons.
The Ritz.
The Ritz, yes, which displaced massive food cart block that was a valuable cultural resource to the city and to the people who used that part of the city either for work or as residents, as well as tourists. And then there's unhoused folks who do form a community of culture in this place, not necessarily a monolithic one, but who are attempting to use this space to meet basic fundamental human needs, and for whom this particular site has been taken off limits in a way that has profoundly more significant impact than people who have a, you know, a hotel bed or an office building to shelter in over the course of the day. And if we're approaching it from the perspective of trying to serve everyone equally, we'll fail, because not everyone is coming to this space with the same set of needs or the same existing welcoming dynamic. There's already a hierarchy in place socially around who is allowed to be in space in downtown Portland and who is not. I think dialogue is valuable, but I think centering those who have the most to gain from this space in terms of meeting their foundational human needs and the most to be lost or the most harm that they're subject to if their needs are not considered and they have no influence over the space. That's where I would start. And I wouldn't necessarily put the Ritz and all of the service provider organizations that exist around the square in the same room from the jump and expect them to have a productive, meaningful dialogue with one another. So 2 cents.
Yeah. Damon, thoughts from afar, what you've seen so far?
Well, you know, I'm guessing that you're being a little rhetorical with your question, Randy, but, you know, I gotta say, you know, that framing, it sounds kind of like some old, you know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau or something, right? And, you know, and I feel like one of the lessons of the history of community design and designers trying to learn from people who do the work of community organizing is that we're not talking about something as abstracting, you know, as that. It's like much more imminent, right? You know, from the perspective of someone who's worked on projects that seemed like very hard to pull off and that required a lot of good luck and a lot of strong-willed people, you know, it really oftentimes for a public space project meant like really just like knocking on a lot of doors and being like, who can we convince that this is like somehow in their interest? That how can, you know, who out there? Because, you know, when it comes down to it, of all the things in this world, one thing still that even the most money and power cannot buy is a successful public space, I think, of the sort that's been discussed, right? It takes people power, you know. So when Kareem, when you were talking about, you know, some of the analysis that y'all do, you know, I thought, you know, about the kind of power mapping that labor organizers and community organizers do to be like, all right, who are the people that are, you know, both like officially connected to the space in the sense that they're like the government or they have some legal authority, and, you know, and who are the people that exert will in other ways, like they're on the board of the business improvement district, and who are the other people who, you know, have other claims to the space because of like the history of youth activism or skaters or queer history or whatever it is, and many of the things that we've heard about, you know, in this, you know. So I feel like, a lot of this work of design in service of organizing is about like trying to figure out if we can be a part of whatever amalgamates critical mass to like actually make something happen, right? That actually has the kind of value that we're talking about. And so, when I was saying that we don't really talk about like just space, I think, I really meant that in the sense of like within like a design project, because I think, and this, I think, there is a lot of commonality in what we've all talked about. You're talking about, if you're talking about just space, you're talking about something that is like a very long-term, constant struggle, like full of crises and shortfalls and ways to like solve the problem and like fill the gap temporarily, in which design might play a role, like might make a contribution if like things work out well and like you really focus for a little bit. And and so in those terms, and I think this also has been said in other ways, you're never doing like community engagement, right? Because like the project is not like the central thing that's either getting like these atomized comments from people, right? Like actually the project has to shapeshift in order to take on the relationships necessary for the thing to happen. My friends over in UK called MUF say, before you make the thing, you have to make the relationships, right? And I think that's something that we're all saying here. So
yeah, I think let me kind of slightly reframe the question and see if it brings it. I think what I was trying to get at is that there's a lot of transient elements to to that geography. There's hotels, there's commerce that's being done. The social services. Most of the people who are engaged with that are transitory. The kids, like I was, thinking about, the interface with PAIR, which is devoted to, homeless kids and getting them involved in art and other community. And I was, thinking about how we're going to talk to them. And it's sort of like, yeah, you're really talking for the next group of kids or the third or fourth, group of kids, down the line, because it's just a very transient place. The landowners are the entrenched element, and those who have leased property are the ones that are there all the time. And so it's kind of an interesting thing, because I think about you guys' work, and it's with people who are really often, at least the examples you showed, is people who have been undervalued in their place around a park, and it's sort of a different thing. And I'm kind of trying to figure out how we get at that. We're trying to do it through these multiple focus groups, and per Kareem's thing, we are doing them sort of separately. We're going to bring them together at some point, but the first conversations are happening separately. So it's it's just an interesting puzzle, especially because the groups are so extremely different.
I guess one reflection that I'd bring to that, and I'll bring the reflection and then there's a question attached to it. We're never, as designers, starting with a clean slate, right? We're never starting with oh, this is actually a totally empty site and nothing outside of this boundary really impacts it, right? But not only physically or spatially, but in terms of social movements and in terms of organizing and in terms of communities identifying the issues that impact them, identifying ways to address those issues, and advocating for the resources required to meaningfully do that. What movements and organizations exist in this city that have already been putting forth proposals for just use of space in the downtown area, if we want to geographically center it here, but it doesn't have to be on this square to understand all the movement and organizing and work that has happened. And this square can be a platform or a venue or an avenue for either temporary installations and interventions that prototype what the actual desired outcomes are, or permanent installations or interventions that might not be looking to the direct neighbors, but are again looking to the communities that have already put proposals forward. Like everything that we might try to imagine or think up, communities have already been thinking of and trying to address they might not have had designers on board to help navigate the technical processes or the bureaucratic processes or logistical processes, but they've certainly got the issues dialed in and they have proposed solutions in place. And so I think identifying those groups as a starting point, and maybe looking beyond the immediate geography would be a good place to do that. And I'd actually love to know, because I don't have experience with temporary installations or with that kind of field of design in the same way. Kelsey, what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I just thought of like, in a way, Randy, your question reminds me of like sideways thinking. It's like the literal problem that we have, or is, this square that we can redesign with the neighbors that are around it, and it doesn't have a set of like, neighbors. Maybe the neighbors aren't really clear. It's these commercial stakeholders who are more like businesses running adjacent to the square, not a community next to the square, and we don't really have a good definition. And so how do you build a sense of community with this whole bunch of businesses and like who aren't connected to this houseless community that's also adjacent to it that has no there? And I think the sideways way of looking at it is like zooming out in the city and thinking about like doing some map of time over the city, of like doing several different overlays of this space, like thinking about it in like time and space continuum, in the way that like, what is the annual cycle of Portland? And where would this square fit in the annual cycle of Portland through the seasons of the event schedules? We know there are these huge like like there's cycling events and performing arts events, and there's so many different types of event schedules that mapping those over the city and an overlay with O'Brien Square in there, like what role could it play there in over this, over time? And then you think about people flow over all of those things. Like, what are the daily routines of where are people coming from all over the area, and who's the confluence of people coming and overlapping in those spaces? It's just another way of looking at it sideways, of like, they're not residents, but there's certainly visitors that are coming through. Are they on their way to Powell's consistently? Like, who walks through here? Who is adjacent? Who isn't walking through here, but could be walking through here if this was a welcoming space? And what are those flows like? And who is a part of them? And how could they become participants in this thing? And then you think about, okay, all the other parks, pocket parks and different types of parks in the city, and who are they and what are they doing and what's their programming and how are they connected? Like, that's another sideways way of thinking of it, is like, who are the neighbors of this park? Who are the park neighbors of this park? Like, not as a direct neighbor, but like there are different kinds of neighbors. Who are the cultural institutions who need space for programming, who don't have a space? Like, Open Signal or Portland, people who want to have more, who need a front porch, who don't have a front porch, who could be using this as their porch or living room. So I think creating some maps of who the friends and neighbors would be, and thinking a little bit sideways about time and space, might give us some better clues of who could be a part of the conversation to create a future there, who might not on the surface of it feel like they're stakeholders, but actually would be. Like, if you turn that around, who would be miffed if we just decided this was like a foosball court, or who would be miffed if we decided this is a parking lot? Like, who, like, and like want to call up? Like, I bet there are people who would start to say something who currently aren't, because it's nothing.
That's actually a really interesting thing to think about. So I have a question from Steve Dodder, who's a longtime planner, transportation and urban planner in the city. In the Mifflin Square story, the most positive and feared outcomes were prepared. I'm not quite sure what he means by that, but how were those used in discussions and negotiating designs? So I'm going to try to divine that. Maybe Steve can clarify it a little bit, or maybe you get it, Damon. I don't know.
I think you might be referring to one of the drawings that was prepared by the teenage investigators.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Earlier in the process, that was called Park Dreams and Nightmares, after Meek Mill's Dreams and Nightmares. And so that and the other drawings, that looked at things like, what is the city's capital process for designing and delivering a park? And what have been success and failure stories of other, resident organizations that have tried to influence that process in terms of how that space, begins to respond to them. And so that park, so that one, the students who led it up and then got everyone to draw the pieces of it, the way they used it was just like introducing both sides of it, and then talking to people about, their Mifflin Park dreams and their Mifflin Park nightmares. And being teenagers, they of course enjoyed talking about some of the details of the nightmares, like drawing every single illegal narcotic they had ever heard of, for example.
Yeah, interesting. Let's see, another question that's come up here. Were the potluck and the park organizers invited to participate? We're still reaching out to them, trying to figure out. I've reached out to them, but we'd like to have them there. There's a long time, just so you know, there's a long time potluck in the park in which food was served there routinely. And sometimes there's, it was a bit of tension around that because, it resulted in a lot of garbage too, and so there wasn't really a cleanup program around it, and so that created some tension. But certainly that feeding people in lots of different ways has been a discussion at around O'Brien, ranging from food carts to bringing back potluck in the park and some of the other mutual aid organizations that have been traditionally involved in open spaces in Portland. It's an interesting, balance with of things, just given the, like, again, the extreme dichotomy between the Behavioral Health Resource Center and the other entities around there. It was in Willamette Week today. The tensions are really popping out in the open in a big way. So it's going to be a real negotiation ongoing. And we'll get to see the sort of the full flower of it in the coming days, actually. So excited about it, terrified by it. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting place. And I think that Kelsey gets at something in terms of thinking about how you have to kind of divine a community of stakeholders for it, because it is transient in many ways, and there's just a lot of commercial pressures. There's a lot of social service pressures, and there's a lot of pressures on public space, I think, in downtown right now. And it's I sit on the board of Pioneer Courthouse Square, and just the number of incidents recorded there that are vandalism and other kinds of things that are more dangerous are really, really continuing to spike. And so these are all things that are going to have to be considered within this little block of space. So it's a wicked problem, but we're bringing some great thinkers to it. Anything you guys want to add before we close up here?
I'd like to maybe bring one consideration, which is that concern or that question around how to bring resources to sustain a space, just from a maintenance standpoint. When we're thinking about the structures and systems that we're working within, and the policy and procedural elements of that. This is something that we talked about on the Jefferson High School project with students, where we're in class talking to them about design justice. And the Jefferson High School project, for example, is a big project. It's a 350 million plus project budget, which is substantial. And it's one time, it's happening now, and it hasn't happened for a long time. And in contrast to that, Portland Police Bureau's annual budget is around $250 million. So every year, this city they just bought a new plane, right? And we don't have all the maintenance gear or staffing required to handle the snowstorm that hit the city last week unexpectedly, right? But at that same time, the city approves millions of dollars for a new plane to fly over the city and surveil. So although I know some of the conversation over the last few years, following the movement for Black Lives and the uprisings for civil rights and social justice and racial justice that we saw have sort of subsided in a way, those issues remain at the core of how we express our values in our society and in our city. And I would just ask the question, if we were investing in the types of resources and activities and spaces in our public realm that met fundamental human need and didn't try to displace or shuffle off or hide or police behavior that has been criminalized, how would that change what we imagine is possible? And just as an example, I was in Barcelona right before the pandemic hit. I was actually planning on going to grad school there. And it was International Women's Day. There was a huge march and demonstration and rally. And there were mobile childcare units, just in the street for kids and families to be able to participate, that had municipal funding behind them. And I did not see police trucks at every corner. I saw caregiving resources being directed into public space. So what if that was an option? What if we were fully funding childcare in public spaces in our cities? How would that change the way that people treat them or take care of them or view them as hostile or hospitable?
Well, there's a relevant and large questions that I don't know that we can address here, but we can start a conversation. And maybe there's a way to bring that conversation, in some form to O'Brien through some of the means of activation. I think one thing that's come out of tonight for me is to think about, that activation can be, a set of questions, can raise a set of questions. I think that Kelsey's work, shows the possibilities, and thinking about crossbreeding that with the work that you guys are doing, seems like it could be an avenue. There's a couple other questions, and then we'll wind it up. One is how would O'Brien Park differentiate itself or be the through line between the North and South Park blocks, which is really interesting question, and one that we want to keep kind of on the table, both that and what its relationship is to Pioneer Courthouse Square and Director Park. There's kind of an ensemble of spaces there, but the two locals, you have any theories you want to share real quick on that?
I'll pass on that one and let the workshops
Yeah.
that question.
Just to like kind of set expectations, is every idea like this, or even just issue that we see arising, gets the ability to be heard and put in, even if it's just a series of complaints, it all becomes a criteria we can use to design against, to say like, this is failing. That's like, we can allow ourselves to say like, all this garbage is not working, And those we can flip to say, like, how do we get it to work? Let's look at it. Like, this becomes what we use as a criteria for moving forward to start to build solutions. So how will it differentiate? I mean, that's our question for ourselves. Okay, like, how will it be? How is the city planning on ongoing maintenance and staffing? We can make that a criteria for the park to say, like, look, it just is a need in this park. So maybe Portland Parks and Rec can't support it, but we've got neighbors who have a skin in the game, and they might be able to fund an ongoing, like a model for ongoing maintenance there. And maybe that can get government funding through, grant writing. Like, there's so many different ways that we can address these things. And it just means using a thoughtful process to make sure that we're bringing the right folks to the table, questioning the power structures, who is able to have a voice and who is able to make change in order to truly address some of the issues that are happening in the city and truly involve the people who can make a difference, so that this can be a relevant player in the city. It just takes a thoughtful process. And I do believe that we're setting the table to be able to do that. And it's just the beginning.
Well, with that, thank you all for sharing your ideas and thoughts and work with us. A really great end of the series, and I look forward to seeing Damon in 3 dimensions and Kelsey in 3 dimensions, and Kareem, I hope we see you too at some point during the charrette and community visioning process. And as again, I just want to caution everybody, this is the first phase. We create a set of programs and hunt money and execute and see what happens and learn from it, and then execute some more. So again, one more time, Wednesday next week, everybody can come down to Finnegan's at 820 Southwest Washington. And then on the 11th, you can come and see what we distill from all of this feedback we've been getting. And look forward to seeing you all there. And thanks again to our sponsors for this great series. And good night, everyone.